Hi everyone, welcome to NowThis Politics continuing coverage on election night 2018. I'm Versha Sharma, NowThis senior correspondent and managing editor. So polls have now closed in 8 states, and we have 2 calls that we can already make. Tim Kaine has won his re-election for Senate in Virginia, and Bernie Sanders has won re-election to the Senate out of Vermont. So I'm here with a great panel tonight. We have Carrie Twigg, cultural strategist, Judd Legum joining us again after last hour, the founder of Popular Information, and David Rothschild, pollster and founder of PredictWise. So we're going to be coming to you live at the top of every hour as the polls close, bringing you the most immediate results, analysis, answering any questions that you have. And we kind of have our own version of the CNN magic wall. It's called David and his whiteboard over here.
It's a little lower tech.
It's a little lower tech, but it's got the right information. So David, why don't you talk us through what's happening?
Yeah, so going into this evening, the Democrats were looking pretty strong with about 208 House seats that were in very good shape, and the Republicans had, a little less than 200. And we're looking at about 33 toss-ups. So one of the first things we're seeing coming out of the 6 o'clock hour is that there was just one of those toss-up seats. That was the Kentucky race with McGrath. That is looking really, actually slightly leaning towards her way, but that is a good indication that things are looking okay for the Democrats, so we're not going to get too far ahead of ourselves. We look in the Senate elections, not much information was going to come out in that first hour. We're still looking at the Democrats kind of with about 42 really strong, Republicans 46. There's 4 that are leaning, and I'd kind of say that Florida's looking pretty good for them as well. And you got 4 that are leaning pretty heavily Republican, including that Texas and Tennessee races that people have been following so closely, with Missouri, Arizona, and Indiana as pure toss-ups. And that Indiana race also has some data coming out, and that's still looking pretty much like a toss-up. And governor's races, we don't have that much information. Georgia, it will be closing, and that one is still way too early to call. So right now, we're looking at, basically the board has been staying about the same from the first hour.
Great, thank you, David. Now we're imagining Georgia's probably going to be a very tight race, so we may not have results for a while, but polls did just close in that state, so hopefully we'll have something that we can talk about soon. So Carrie, I want to hear what you're interested in tonight. What are you looking out for?
I'm really interested in how and the extent to which we see big participation out of young people.
Yes.
Obviously, that's something that we've been talking about, and it's been in the...
Love the shirt.
Yes. And that has been in the press quite a bit, the historic levels of registration and early voting. So I'm very curious to see how that actually unfolds.
Yeah.
And then second, I'm really interested in just the broader vote totals in some of the less competitive places. I know that there's a lot of interesting horse races tonight, but I really want to know the extent to which people are participating, sometimes waiting in really long lines for races that aren't competitive, we are in this moment where we're having a heightened awareness around civic engagement broadly and what that actually means for a longer term understanding of what's going on in this country.
Yeah, I know a lot of people, I've spoken to a lot of people today who they readily admitted that they've never voted in a midterm election before. And they're like, look, in the past, especially in 2010 and 2014, I was complacent. I wasn't interested. But now I understand the significance of these midterms, which is something that we did talk a little bit about last hour. But Jed, I'd love for you to go into that a little bit again.
Yeah, just on the youth voting, Next Gen America, which is run by Tom Steyer, who spent a lot of money trying to influence this midterm elections. They've been tracking precincts at college campuses, which gives you a little bit of a sense of like what the youth vote is, and the numbers that they provided so far suggest that it is elevated. You also do, from the exit polls, have an increased or an elevated number of first-time voters, people who never voted before in a midterm election, about 15% of the total this year. I think it was about 10% last time, so that's a significant increase of first-time voters. Generally, you don't get a ton of first-time voters in a midterm because you don't have that big presidential race at the top of the ticket. But I'm going to be really interested as the night unfolds. You had Tim Kaine win. He was up against Corey Stewart, who really was running as a big defender of Confederate monuments on an appeal to white nationalists, out of step with where Virginia is going right now. But one of the races I'm really, really interested in is in Iowa. Steve King basically running the same kind of race, but this time in a more rural section of Iowa, and it might be a race. I mean, this was a district that Donald Trump won by 27 points, but some of the recent polls show it close. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out and the type of rhetoric that Trump has really stoked and really tried to energize a lot of the racial resentments with his rhetoric on the caravan, and how does that play out? Is there a backlash, or does he get that surge of voters in these rural areas that he's looking for?
Yeah, I think a lot of people were expecting, he had no public events scheduled today, so people were expecting him to kind of just like go ham on Twitter, but I think he's been kind of quiet so far, right? I mean, comparatively, compared to the usual and what we've seen.
Well, I'll extend from something you were saying there, which is that the media's really been focusing on how his move towards immigration, his xenophobia and racism has been playing well with the base, but they haven't paid enough attention to the backlash that could be generating, because we've been seeing pretty good numbers coming out of Latinos, reasonably looking optimistic towards vote turnout and preference for Democrats. There was a very big surprise, although it's very hard to actually break this down, on the Latino vote for Donald Trump, that he was getting similar numbers that previous Republican presidencies had gotten, despite the very harsh rhetoric, and maybe that has been moving. We also have some of this backlash also for African American voters, but also as well as youth voters. So as far as what this could lead to, he not only took the attention off the economy, which is a reasonable story for him to say, he put the attention on something in which he was playing to his base, but was also alienating, a very potentially large group of people who could be out there voting.
Yeah.
A bunch of the other races that I'm keeping an eye on are going to be the state executive level races going into 2020. It's obviously a census year, so there's going to be reapportionment and redistricting happening on the state level, and so the secretaries of states and those apportionment board seats that have an influence over how those states redistrict, I think, are going to be really important.
Yeah, that's going to be key. I think we did an interview with Eric Holder, the former Attorney General of the United States. He's now the chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, and he had some really interesting metaphors basically about whether or not we're going to see a blue wave tonight. And he said, look, I think there's no question a blue wave is going to happen, but the question is, it's going to meet a wall of Republican gerrymandering. Is how much over that wall will it make it?
Let me just make a point which we should be repeating over and over again. The Democrats will get millions of more votes than the Republicans tonight.
Absolutely.
In any other democracy, that is the bar you need to cross in order to control the government. There is still a chance the Democrats could get millions of more votes and have no control at any position in this government, and that's not good.
Absolutely. And that's going to be the case on the state house level as well as on the federal level.
Yeah.
And that's really what sets these long-term agendas and these long-term sort of structures that we're seeing an attempt from the left to try and undo. But when you look at the vast difference between the number of local and state seats that are held by Republicans versus Democrats, I mean, it's all a function of this long-term game, this long-term process. So I'll be paying really close attention to that.
Yeah, and I think that we've been dancing around these questions about voter suppression as well. And something to think about is that the Republican policies are incredibly unpopular when it comes to, say, taxes and health care and other things that have ranked among the most important. And we've seen them, let's say, lying about the implications for some of the things with pre-existing conditions, which they're trying to take away coverage for, or their taxes, which are squarely aimed at the wealthy. But the next thing, if that doesn't work, is division, which we've been talking about, but also voter suppression, because you cannot win a majority of the seats in the government for too long with a really, really unpopular agenda unless you make it difficult for people who are against you to vote. And so they have this three-pronged strategy of lying, which we've seen, of disunity, kind of breaking people apart, which we've seen, and then voter suppression. And this is something that can only get worse if they continue to try to have unified government with these types of policies.
Right, and the voter suppression piece is already well underway. I mean, the number of bills that have been passed in states across the country instituting very restrictive and draconian. I'm gonna get there. voter ID laws, registration laws, the fact that you here in New York, the early voting. I mean,
I know it's no excuse early voting.
It's absolutely ridiculous, and the fact that there's been a contraction of voting rights in so many states, even within the window of the last 10 years, where you had some states institute, when under Democratic leadership, institute early voting just to have it be taken away over the course of the next few years. So all of that's well underway, and we're seeing the implications of that when you are watching news and hearing about long lines. Today in Brooklyn, no major contested race, no major competitive partisan races on the ballot. People were waiting in line for 3.5 hours. And
scanners were broken.
Scanners were broken. There were, you know, there's a polling place that didn't have an electric, not even because of the storms in Tennessee, but because they didn't have a power extension. I mean, just there's places that have run out of ballots in Florida. It's just unbelievable. But that's all a function of the voter suppression tactics that have been unfolding for years.
You really saw that play out in Georgia today, where Brian Kemp has, under his supervision, they shut down 214 polling locations over the last several years, and people were in line for 4.5 hours. And at that length of line, it's really a luxury.
That's half a day.
Because a lot of people, if you're someone who's paid hourly, who doesn't get credit for or the flexibility to go out and vote, you can't wait 4.5 hours.
You have young kids, you have class. I mean, unbelievable.
So, there's the question of if you're even able to with your job, and then some of the people in Brooklyn I saw after 3 hours at one poll site in Crown Heights are like, I'm leaving. Like I can't do this. But I think another important thing to remember as we talk about these stories is there are a number of election protection resources that people are working on across the country. If you yourself are experiencing any problems, call 1-866-RVOTE. That's the National Election Protection Hotline. ProPublica is running a project called Election Land, where they're collecting all of these reports across the country. That's another resource to kind of look through, where they can walk you through the different scenarios. If for some reason you're dealing with a scenario where you're not registered or you're not on the rolls, you can always cast a provisional ballot at your location. So there are resources for these types of things when they happen, which I think is important for people to know.
And I think that's one of the difficulties when you're trying to cover the different barriers that are being put into place to vote, is that that in itself can discourage people from voting. The idea that it's rigged against them, there's so many barriers. The most powerful thing you can do is actually go vote, and in most cases,
be stubborn about it.
If you do have the time, you will be able to cast your ballot, even though we have an aging and ineffective system in which people cast their ballots. But I think it's important to try to persevere through that. And this is a long process, but if we see tonight that some state houses switch, state level governments switch, that might mean that in 2020 it might be a little easier for people to vote, and they might have to wait in line a little bit less than they do now. So each election builds on itself. Right now we're reaping the benefits of a bunch of elections that have basically gone towards the Republicans, especially at the state level.
Well, it's been something we've been tracking with the NowThis PredictWise polling as well. We've seen voter suppression as something which people did not take seriously. In 2016, we had 30% of people say it was a serious problem. Our most recent poll last week, it was up above 60%. People are recognizing that this is an issue, and people are recognizing that, as I think as you guys are pointing out, the voter ID question, that is a form of voter suppression, but it's not as effective as the really simple thing, long lines when you go vote. Because long lines when you go vote, those are people who are out there and having a bad experience. Having a bad experience makes you less likely to vote in the future, as you're saying. And you know, you have all these images on TV of long lines, and people are like, "Yay, democracy!" And no, that's voter suppression. And recognizing that's a problem is going to be an important first step for people to fight that. But on the flip side of that, people still think voter fraud, the thing that they're protecting against, is an issue. It is not. It is negligible how much voter fraud happens. Republicans have spent a lot of time and money and energy convincing people of this thing. And it's very important to emphasize that when it comes to questions about legitimacy of election, it is all about this voter suppression. And there's just really no voter fraud that is being protected from. And so it is really important that the Democrats make this an important issue if and when they gain control on the state level and then on the national level as well.
Absolutely. Now, as we wrap this up heading into the 8 p.m. hour, we're going to be back at the top of the hour with the latest results. I just want to remind you guys, at the top of this, Tim Kaine was projected to win his re-election to Senate in Virginia. Bernie Sanders projected to win his re-election in Vermont, and Congressman John Lewis, the civil rights hero, is projected to win his re-election to Congress as well. And if you have any problems, again, at the polls, if you're still in line, we've got a couple more hours across the country. You can call 866-R-VOTE. Again, that's 866-R-VOTE if you have any problems, or that's just a number to pass on to all of your friends. So Carrie, Judd, David, what are you looking at for 8 o'clock? What can people expect?
Well, right now what I'm looking at is that Florida's looking pretty good for the Democrats on both the senatorial and gubernatorial races, and so I expect that maybe that Florida seat may move up into that likely or even better in the next few minutes as this goes by, but it's leaning in that direction.
Right.
I'm going to be looking at the Virginia results as they came in. It closed this hour, but we'll start to see some results, and I think that's the first area where there's really a concentration of competitive districts. You'll get to look at, how does Barbara Comstock do, who's in Northern Virginia? If she gets wiped out, that's going to be a bad sign. If it's a close race or if she's ahead, then that's probably a better sign for the Republicans. But I think if you look at Virginia and you start to get a sense of what the complexion of the races are there, you might get a sense of what's going to be happening across the country as we get more of these polls closing.
I'm going to be looking like a good Midwesterner that I am at Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, trying to figure out what's actually happening in the Midwest. Polls close in Ohio, I know, at 7:30. There's a lot of those state executive office races that I mentioned earlier that I'm going to be paying close attention to because I think they're portend sort of what will happen in 2020 to a large degree. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
That's great. We're going to have a lot more information for you next hour then. We will be here all night. Make sure to drop any questions that you have in the comments and we'll try to get to them. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for being here. And make sure you stay tuned to Now This Politics all night for live coverage.